Strong. And Wausau Metro Strong started after the March 22nd, 2017 shootings. There was a group of leaders in our community that felt as though we are a strong community, and if we all come together and build some avenues to make our community even stronger, that they can do that. Jane and Lee will get into way more discussions about the role of domestic violence and the forming of Wausau Metro Strong. Wausau Metro Strong has approximately 70 members with 30 very active members that come to our monthly meetings. And we divide ourselves into several committees. There's an executive committee, there's a communications committee, then there's also the domestic violence committee that Jane and Lee are extremely active in. There's a business committee that works with businesses to represent how we can make businesses more strong or safe. There's a legal committee. They were influential in getting Sarah's law passed, and I guess there's only 5, sorry. Like I said, there were leaders from many different avenues that came together. So we have law enforcement, education, large businesses, small businesses, healthcare, and every kind of industry that you can think of in our area, manufacturing, things like that. We have members representing all of those areas to make a better group. Please, you're welcome to join us for our monthly meetings. They're here at NTC, but in the Center for Business and Industry. We meet every 4th Tuesday of the month at 11:30. If you're interested in being a part of our group, you can just come, but if you want to have a personal contact just to let us know that you're coming, please feel free to contact me. I was listed on my email and things like that are listed on all the invitations. So if we just recap what we've done in the past, we've, as a group, decided that one way that we can reach out to the community is by hosting educational sessions such as these. So the business committee hosted 2 in the past. The first one was with Officer Chad Billup of the Marathon County Sheriff's Department, and he taught businesses about facility plans and emergency notification systems. And last month, Erin Henderson from REI Engineering talked about emergency action planning. And the takeaways from that were that if you have 10 or more employees, you need to have a written emergency action plan. All businesses should have an emergency action plan that should be reviewed regularly and also trained on and communicated with your team. So, moving on to today, we're starting part 1 of our 3-part domestic violence series. So today, Lee Shipway, the Executive Director of Peaceful Solutions Counseling, and the Executive Director of the Women's Community, will be discussing domestic violence and its place in the workplace, which unfortunately it has a place. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you all for being here and taking an interest in understanding how domestic violence plays out. Lee and I have been working together for my entire tenure. I've been executive director for 20 years and I've been women's committee for 23 years. And Lee was doing that work prior to that. So for at least 2 decades, we have been working together to raise awareness and try to combat domestic violence in our community. And so we are still continuing to do that, and even 20 years later, we're still facing some of the exact same battles that we started when I was just a baby advocate. So the other thing to understand about that we'll be talking about are the complexities around these things. And so part of both of our educational histories and something that we do because they're so complex is we are trained expert witnesses to address domestic violence in the criminal justice system. So that when there's a prosecution going through, prosecutors from around the state contact us to ask us if we could come and testify to help jurors understand domestic violence. Because there are many things that people think are counterintuitive, and actually they're not at all when you understand what's happening in the minds of victims. But because it's so complex and because people really have a hard time understanding that, we are asked to come in and train as expert witnesses. So that's my background.
So as Jane said, we've been working together for many decades. I've been a licensed mental health therapist in the Wausau area for the last 37 years, which I can't believe it. In some ways it feels like 50, in some ways it feels like it was yesterday. I'm the executive director of Peaceful Solutions Counseling, which is a private, local, nonprofit counseling agency. We're licensed for mental health as well as substance abuse counseling, and we specialize in domestic violence. We provide services for victims of domestic violence, do individual therapy, as well as we provide a group called Beyond Survival for women who have left an abusive relationship or who still are in an abusive relationship, trying to help them heal from the trauma of being in that relationship. Oftentimes people suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of being in a domestic abuse relationship, just like if they were a combat veteran, if they had been in a hurricane or a tornado. The other program that we specialize in is called the SAFE program, Stopping Abuse for Everyone, which is a domestic abusers treatment program. So we do about 4 to 5 groups a week, and it's primarily men that are being arrested and charged with that because it's primarily men who are the abusers. We do occasionally get women through the system. We have them, if it seems like they are truly abusive, which is very few and far between, go to individual therapy with one of our trained therapists. The vast majority of women are victims of domestic abuse, and they either retaliated against their abuser or they have learned from their abuser and have carried that into the relationship, or they're acting in self-defense, and law enforcement had a difficult time being able to discern if that's what was going on, and then they were arrested. I then refer them for individual counseling. So the thing that brought us here originally with Wausau Metro Strong was the tragedy that happened on March 22nd.
And what's really important to understand about this is to put it in context that every person in this room knows someone who is experienced currently or has experienced domestic abuse in their relationship. It is a common thing that happens all the time. And that's one thing that we want people to take away, is if you think you don't know, you're wrong. Every one of us knows someone, even if we don't know that we know them. Victims are still very afraid to tell people what's happening, particularly to employers. They fear they are going to lose their job because they're being heard by someone they love. They're trying to figure that out. They're afraid of how they're going to be viewed. What happened on March 22nd was one individual who believed he was entitled to hurt other people did so. And he did that because his wife had the audacity to stand up for herself. Karen Barkley and Diane Look are heroes because they knew that their coworker was in danger, and they ushered her out the back door of their place of employment so that she could live, and they lost their lives doing it. People at the bank knew that this was a violent man. There were signs and there were signals, and there are things that we can do to prevent this from happening again in our community. He also, of course, then targeted Sarah Kurtz-Sand, who was providing attorney for his wife, and he did not like that. He believed that he should have everything that he wanted, and whatever his wife wanted, and the people who were getting in the way of his wants should be taken out, and that's what he did. And of course, we have Detective Weiland, who in the line of duty lost his life because this one man felt entitled. That's why Wausau Metro Strong exists, because of domestic abuse. And we can never lose sight of that. We can't forget, because it's easy, and we're going to talk about why this is so hard to talk about, why we want to look the other way, why when the headlines go away, we focus on all these other things except the reason why we're here. can't ever lose sight of that. When we're talking today, what we want to talk about and get people to understand is what domestic abuse is. We're going to use domestic abuse and domestic violence kind of interchangeably, partially because domestic violence is a term that are used in a lot of our statutes and a lot of our materials. But we also want people to be clear that abuse is a continuum. It's not always violent. So we have people that are experiencing significant levels of abuse that have long-term psychological and health effects that never get hit. So it's part of what we recognize that it happens, but domestic violence is the term that's often used. So what we really need to understand is this is not an explosive incident. This is not something that happened one time and then they get over it. This is a pattern of coercive behavior. That's what we're talking about. When I do law enforcement training around understanding how to respond to abuse, because we understand this concept, it is not an incident, it is not an anger management problem, it is not someone who needs to go and figure out how to contain their anger. People who use power and control are very contained. They know exactly where to exert their power, and it's on the person that they claim to love. When we're doing training with law enforcement, we talk about this. Our state statutes for investigating domestic abuse have mandated strategies to give law enforcement the tool to try to figure out what is happening in these very complex situations. Because we understand there is often a history, even if there has been no prior call, no prior arrest. Law enforcement is required by state statute to figure out the history, to really determine what's happening. And that is an extremely difficult job for law enforcement. What if I go to a house and I know something is happening, but one of the parties won't say anything? How do I get the information I need to determine who is the predominant aggressor so I can figure this out? How do I determine if this individual was acting in self-defense if they won't give me any information? It's very complex, but we need to understand it's not someone who can't control themselves. It is quite the opposite. It's a pattern of behavior over time.
The other term that sometimes you'll see in the literature, or you might hear us talk about, is intimate partner violence, or IPV. That's a term that the Centers for Disease Control coined, if you will, when they looked at the statistics nationally and saw that this really is a health crisis in our country, that we have so many women being killed by intimate partners. So instead of domestic violence or domestic abuse, they also used intimate partner violence. So we might use all three of those interchangeably. So what you're seeing here is the power and control wheel. This was developed by Duluth, Minnesota, the leaders in domestic violence treatment decades ago, probably 38, 40 years ago now. And what it shows is what Jane was talking about, that there's many different types of controlling behaviors. By using control against a partner, you're trying to keep her under your thumb so that she doesn't do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable and raises your own feelings of insecurity and inadequacy. That's the two most common traits that I see in the batterers that I treat, is that they feel insecure, they feel inadequate, and coupled with that, we have a society backdrop that says men should be in control, men should have more power than women, and there's a power differential. The fourth part to that I see is abusers grow up in families where either they've seen their mothers abused by their dads, or they themselves were abused as children. The fifth ingredient to the recipe to creating a batterer is never ever holding him accountable for his behaviors. So I oftentimes with guys in the group see where they were always bailed out by mom and dad. I mean, from little on, if they did something bad at school and confronted by the teacher, the parents would not back up the teacher. Instead, they would side with their son and say, oh no, my son wouldn't do that, and never hold him accountable. All of those things together over a long period of time forms a sense of entitlement, that he feels like he can do what he wants when he wants because he has a right to that. Do we want to go through all these, you think?
Well, we wanted to give you a couple of examples to try to understand what this means. So on the outside of this wheel are the things we most often associate with abuse: physical and sexual violence. And by the way, most victims of abuse do not talk about the sexual abuse that they are experiencing on a regular basis within that relationship. You cannot have consensual sex with someone you are afraid of. But they don't talk about that part. But it's common in abusive relationships. So this big outer circle is the physical abuse, but it doesn't always get to that level. So what do we mean? Using emotional abuse, making someone think that they're crazy. So this is, if you've seen over the last few years, we've seen a lot about gaslighting. So this idea that someone changes and manipulates the environment to make someone think that they're crazy. And this is a common tactic. Let me give you a story of how that might play out. So I was working with someone who said she was always misplacing her keys. And they would wind up in the oddest places. So she always put her keys in her purse and they would be gone and she couldn't find them. And then her boyfriend said, "Oh, honey, you left your keys in the freezer. Gosh, you must have been really tired yesterday when you came home." And she's like, "Oh, yeah, I don't even remember doing that." "Oh, okay." The next time she can't find her keys, she put them, "Honey, why are your keys in the bathroom medicine cabinet? Are you sure you're okay? You know, you are awfully stressed out at work. Or maybe you should quit that job. I've been telling you how hard that has been on you, and you've been having really difficult times. I mean, I'm really starting to worry about you, that you don't even know where you put your keys, and why would you put them there?" So she really starts to question herself. She doesn't remember any of these times because she never did that. When she got away from him, she started to think about, she said, "Surprise, I didn't lose my keys anymore." So she was second guessing everything she was doing because he was intentionally taking her keys and putting them in odd places and then appearing to be very concerned about her mental well-being while he was doing that to her. So that's what we're talking about, this intentional manipulation that keeps victims second guessing everything that they're doing, and they can't quite figure it out. They are literally being brainwashed in these relationships. I don't know if you have other examples.
I just want to add, so if you think about this on a continuum, that's a pretty severe, unusual behavior. I'm sure a lot of you are shocked to hear that that goes on in relationships. Let me move it down the continuum a little bit for you and tell you the more common things that we hear is name calling. So often, the guys that come in our program, when they have to go through their homework assignments and list the different things that they've done on this wheel, it's like I could write the exact same recipe for all of them. And I can't say the words because we're being taped and they're really yucky words, but let me give you some examples. It would be the word that starts with C that rhymes with hunt. It would be the word that starts with B that rhymes with witch. It would be the word for when a woman is promiscuous and it starts with an S and ends with a T. Those are like the most common things that we hear, but there's all kinds of other horrible, nasty names that they call these women. What people don't realize is they think that, oh, if that ever happened to me, I would walk away. I would end that relationship. I wouldn't stay. But he does it so gradually over time that she doesn't even realize that it's happening. I really liken it to the same as brainwashing. Because think about it. So many women I've worked with who've been in abusive relationships are beautiful, competent, confident women. And then after 5, 10, 15 years in a relationship, they end up having no self-esteem whatsoever. And they say, you know what, I used to have good self-esteem. It's like because he's chipped away at it, little by little. It might be something more subtle like, honey, I'm going to the grocery store today. Would you like me to pick you up some Slim Fast? So he didn't call her fat, did he? But he's telling her that he thinks she's overweight by those subtle things. Little by little, when you do that to someone's psyche, they start to not feel good about themselves and their self-esteem goes out the door, and then that makes them much more vulnerable to being controlled by all the other parts of the wheel.
So the other thing to really think about that is common are the threats that often come in these relationships. And there are very direct threats of, I'm going to kill you if you ever try to leave me. I'm going to kill our children if you ever try to leave me. And when that happens, and it does, victims currently hearing those threats see how true those threats are. And it keeps them more afraid to tell anyone what's happening. It's a very difficult thing because we know people are being threatened all the time, but it doesn't rise to the level of an investigation. And that's where things get really difficult. When someone is threatening to kill someone, but there's not enough evidence there for it to be a criminal act. How do we put protections in place for those people? So we really have to take threats seriously and understand that. And so that's part of what we want people to think about. When you are with someone and they say, even like, oh, I don't know, he said he was gonna kill me. Or he said he was gonna kill himself. That is something to be concerned about. Most often in domestic abuse, homicides, suicides, we need to interpret when an abusive person says, I'm going to kill myself, they mean I'm going to kill you and then kill myself. So these are very concerning threats that we all need to think about and take very seriously.
And sometimes abusers will use that threat of suicide to keep her in the relationship. Because she doesn't want him to kill himself, she still loves him because there's good times in between the bad times. And so when he threatens suicide, like, if you leave me, I'm going to kill myself. So she ends up going back. She ends up staying because she doesn't want to have that on her guilty conscience. There's so many different ways that threats are used.
And I just want to step back just for a minute to say, to make sure people are also clear on this. There are women who are abusive and use abuse against their male partners. So that does happen. We don't negate that. We provide the same services and we want the same support for male victims as well as female. There are also same gender relationships where abuse is happening in those relationships as well. Again, we're not negating that. But for the ease of our presentation today, we're going to be using pretty gendered language. And because that's the most data that we have. This is the most common way that abuse is playing out. But please bear in mind, there are women who use force. They are not retaliating, they are the aggressor. And there are same-sex relationships that have abuse happening in them that need the same protections that other relationships need.
So I'll give you an example of intimidation. There's lots of different ways these guys will intimidate. And what you need to really understand, we'll talk about this more in the second session at length, is that all it takes is one act of violence in a relationship to change that balance of power in the relationship. I've had victims where there was one act of violence, but it carried through for the next 20 years. So that anytime she did something he didn't like, he'd give her a dirty look, or he'd bang his fist on the table, or he'd say, okay, do you want to end up in the hospital again? That fear and that intimidation makes it so scary that he can keep her controlled and get her to behave the way he wants her to behave for 20 years. So it isn't like somebody's being battered every single day. I think that's what people think of when they think of domestic violence. It isn't. There's all kinds of periods of good times in between the bad times. There can be years in between some of these physical abusive incidents, or just one. And we'll talk about that more next time. We'll do that. All right, so let's talk about what does make this so uncomfortable to talk about this. First of all, sometimes when you look at that power control wheel, you might look at that and go, oh my God, like my husband's done that to me. Or a man might look at that and say, well, I've done that to my wife or my girlfriend. Oh my God, that means I'm a batterer. Not necessarily. Again, it's a pattern of controlling and abusive behavior over a period of time. In a 25-year marriage, if you called your partner a nasty name once, no, you're not a batterer. You're not an abusive person. I think also, mostly we feel powerless and helpless to do anything. I know that I've talked to people who say, I think my next door neighbor's being abused. I see these odd bruises on her arms, or it's like whenever she's out in the yard talking to me, her husband comes out and he like tells her she needs to get back in the house, and there's just little things that make me feel uncomfortable. So number one about that, trust your gut instincts. If there's something that seems a little off to you, it probably is off. And you need to try to find a way away from him to try to offer her some support. We'll talk about that in the third session. So a lot of times as human beings, when we feel powerless and helpless, our internal psyches find that so difficult to deal with. So what we do instead is try to ignore it. It's a defense mechanism. We just try and push that out of our minds so we don't feel bad and don't feel guilty about not doing anything. Combine that with our cultural norms and views, we've all grown up with kind of the thought that a man's home is his castle and that nobody should be butting into that. It's none of my business. Other people's personal relationships are none of our business. So defense mechanisms that I mentioned before, defense mechanisms are psychological things that help us be able to live with uncomfortable things. You need some defense mechanisms. If you didn't have any defense mechanisms, everything you did and said that was maybe not appropriate would just bother you so badly you wouldn't be able to function. But defense mechanisms working overtime is not helpful. And that's what happens sometimes with this situation as a bystander. So when it's too difficult for us to wrap our brains around something, our brains will distort the facts. That's one of the reasons that Jane and I are expert witnesses at criminal trials, to explain to juries why a 9, 10, 11-year-old child didn't report sexual abuse. Believe it or not, people don't understand that. We also are called upon to testify to explain why victims recant, or why domestic violence victims don't report at all. So this distortion creates disbelief, denial, minimizing, and blaming, because we just don't want to believe that one human being could do something so nasty to another human being. So we think there's got to be some explanation for this. Our brains are wired to try to make sense of things, and when it can't, we come up with something else, even if it's not accurate. So to accept this fact, it means that we have to face being powerless, which means accepting that any one of us could be a victim. So let me share with you, 33 years ago when I started doing batterers treatment, I didn't understand domestic violence totally. And I think anybody who tells you they do when they start this field is either delusional or they're lying to themselves, or lying to you. It probably took a minimum of 3 to 5 years for me to really understand domestic violence. It is so complicated, it is so multi-layered. But I remember back in those days thinking to myself, and mind you, I was 26, probably 27 years old. Well, I'm not a battered woman. I could never be a battered woman. There's battered women, and then there's other women. As time went on, I became to realize that's a bunch of BS. Any woman can be a battered woman, including me. It takes vulnerability. It takes somebody who's very cunning, very conniving, to work their way into a relationship. And before you know it, so many victims say, I don't know how I got here. I can't believe how this happened. It goes back to that brainwashing thing. So I think a lot of times people want to blame the victim because it makes us feel safe. It makes us feel separated. Like if she didn't do that and she wouldn't have said that and she wouldn't have done that, she wouldn't have got hit. Therefore, it's her fault. And then I can feel safe and secure that this is not going to happen to me because I handle things differently. You got to get that out of your mind. Any single one of us could be a victim of domestic violence.
And I think also along those same lines, we as a species, humans, we're just very forgiving people. And that idea that we just don't want to accept that someone could intentionally hurt someone, especially their partner or their children. We just don't want to accept that. So if we look at high-profile cases of domestic violence or sexual assault that we see when the neighbors, and there's a homicide, what is the first thing the neighbors say? I can't believe he would do that.
He seemed so nice. He was so quiet.
He was such a nice guy. I never would have imagined that he was capable of this. This is also why it's so hard for us to work with this, because we all have people in our lives who we've heard do things, who we've seen do things, and we look the other way because that behavior doesn't match with the person we want to believe they are. It's a defense. So instead, we're like, oh, well, they didn't mean that, or they were having a bad day, or we make all kinds of excuses for really poor behavior. And that's what enables people using power and control to continue, because they know we're all going to look the other way. This is why it makes it really hard for us to talk about in our places of employment, because we all have people in our places of employment who use power and control to manipulate their partners. And when we learn that, the first thing we do is look the other way. Because that doesn't marry with the person we think we know. So it's really complex, and it takes a lot of internal work for each of us individually to recognize this person who I thought was this person isn't it. They are someone completely different. So a way to help us work around that, and what we do with kids who grow up in abusive households, we talk about the behaviors, not the person. Because, and Lee's worked with people who change their behavior, and then you realize there really is a person in here who is capable of not harming, but they have to want to change. That's an easier way we can look at it, like, oh, I can't believe someone would do that. We've been friends since high school. So if you take a step back and you start thinking about things that you've seen since high school, you've probably seen behaviors that pointed to this thing, but we ignore it. So to protect ourselves, how do we address this issue? Focus on the behavior, not the person. If someone that you know and trust is doing something really poor that you're afraid of, or you're surprised by, call out that behavior. Hey, man, that's not cool. I don't know why you'd say something like that. That was a really nasty thing. Maybe you should apologize. Are you going to lose that friendship? Maybe. But maybe you'll encourage them to change their behavior so they stop hurting other people. We can have that influence. So a way to get to that, focus on that behavior. What do you want to see done differently? Address the behavior and not just the person.
So let's talk about some local statistics.
So again, the thing we really want people to take away from this is you know someone who has experienced or is experiencing abuse. It is common. It happens all the time, nationally, in our community here. So some local data, really tragic data in our community. In my 20 years as director, we've had 16 domestic violence related deaths of citizens of this community. We all need to be concerned about it. This is a problem. In 2016, there were 574 domestic abuse arrests. 79% of those arrests, the perpetrators were male. Again, females can use abuse, can be abusive, can be violent, but statistically, it is disproportionately affects women as victims and as perpetrators. In 2016, we provided resources to over 1,800 people. So some more recent data for 2018, we provided shelter to 62 adults and 63 children, and we provided outreach to over 695 adults and children. Peaceful Solutions Counseling provided therapy for 85 victims, and the SAFE program, 326 people. If we look again, it's very gendered. So yes?
Do you find that the participants in the SAFE program are typically referred to that program by the court system?
Yes.
Or do you get people who are proactively seeking that type of therapy?
Yes, both. So about 99% of the men in our domestic violence groups are court-ordered, either through a deferred entry of judgment agreement with the district attorney's office and their case managed through Attic Correctional Services, or through probation and parole. And on the court order, it says they have to participate and complete the SAFE program. We get a handful of men every year who come in voluntarily. Sometimes though we call them, instead of court mandated, partner mandated. As in their partner said, I'm going to leave you if you don't go and get some help and do something. Unfortunately, sometimes those men come into the program and leave after about week 5 or 6 out of an 18-week program, or 30-week, depending on their risk level. It's not a lot of them that make it all the way to the end. Because typically what we find is that when she moves back home, he's like, oh, okay, I'm in the clear now, and then he quits coming to therapy.
So what triggers that in the court system then to say that they're mandated to go through that? Because oftentimes we can see situations where somebody's charged with domestic abuse, but then it's modified down to a disorderly conduct.
Even if it's modified down, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Our judges still order them to go through treatment. And that's thanks to something called the Marathon County Domestic Abuse Intervention Team that's been in existence for 35 years. It's a variety of systems working together to make sure that abusers are held accountable and that victims' lives are made as safe as we can. And so the judges are on board with that, the probation officers and the district attorney's office, so they make sure that they get court-ordered treatment. Good question, thank you.
And there's so many complexities within the criminal justice system about how all of these things work. So a little bit about that. We did some research around 2018. We did an average, there was about an average of 11 domestic abuse arrests a week in 2018. Some weeks there was as many as 22 within a 1-week period. So just as an aside, if you know someone in law enforcement, thank them because you have 22 arrests just on one crime. So these are busy folks. trying to address.
And I just want to jump in and say, being in this field for so long, traveling around the state, going to conferences, talking with people, I come back from every conference going, thank God I live and work in Marathon County. Because when I talk to people in other counties, they are not doing the mandatory arrest law correctly. So there is mandatory arrest in Wisconsin that says if these certain things have happened, you have to make an arrest and a referral to the DA. So many other counties, they are not doing that. So be thankful that you are living in this county.
Question at the back.
Do you find that these statistics are getting larger, or is this kind of like a constant rate? You're seeing this many numbers every year.
So that's always a very interesting data point because both. So the thing in understanding domestic abuse is that when it first became a criminalized behavior, when mandatory arrest in the state of Wisconsin came out 30 years ago.
It was 1987, because my son was born that year. That's how I remember that.
So before that, there was no criminal behavior associated with beating up your partner. It was not considered a crime. So when mandatory arrest came into play, what started happening is we recognized this as criminal behavior and arrests started being made. So we see arrests now where we didn't previously. What else happens with that is the more we talk about this as a thing, the more we remove the stigma of shame, then victims reach for help. So there's this strange thing that when we see our numbers go up, it actually might be a good sign for our community, meaning that we've created an environment where victims feel safe to reach out and ask for help, where they didn't before. Because this has been happening since the beginning of time, so I don't think that it's actually happening more, but I think more people are asking for help. More people recognize it. More bystanders are getting involved. Instead of kind of, this isn't any of my business, it's someone else's business, I need to stay out of their personal business, we now recognize that it is in fact our business. Because someone could die if we don't make it our business. So the numbers are always interesting with domestic abuse. When we see them go up, it might actually be a good thing, and hoping that more people are asking for help. The difference between what's referred and what's charged. So there were 563 cases from arrests of predominant aggressors in Maricopa County that went to the DA's office. And there were an additional 109 cases that were referred. So that's just some of the legal language that is different. When law enforcement has to determine a predominant aggressor, they arrest that party, but it may be a very confusing situation again. Maybe the person that they're trying to arrest, one of the parties won't give any information. They can't really figure out what's going on. They know something is off there, so they may arrest one party and they refer the other one to the DA's office for the DA to figure out whether or not there should be charges. So that's what that difference means between domestic abuse arrests and 109 other referrals from law enforcement to our district attorney.
So let's talk about the link between domestic abuse and mass shooting, which a lot of people are shocked when I tell them this. It's not out in the media much, people don't understand this, but there is a huge link between domestic violence abusers being mass shooters. In 57% of mass shootings, the shooter targeted either a family member or an intimate partner. 57%, that's a huge number. According to HuffPost analysis, 64% of mass shooting victims were women and children. That's startling since women typically make up only 15% of total gun violence, homicide victims, and children only 7%. So 42% of mass shootings involved a current or former intimate partner source. Sources every time for gun safety. So 42% of those mass shootings involved a current or former intimate partner. In 54% of mass shootings, the perpetrator also shot an intimate partner or relative. Sources NPR. 70% of mass shootings incidents occurs at home because the actual definition of a mass shooting is deaths of 4 persons or more. You know, we think about the high numbers of the 50s and the 30s and some of the ones across the country, but really it's 4 people or more is considered a mass shooting. So here's some of the high-profile ones that you've seen across the nation, unfortunately, over the last 15 years. Remember the shooter in the Texas church? He was 26-year-old Devin Patrick Kelly. He had been kicked out of the Air Force for bad conduct years ago. Bad conduct included assaulting his wife and her child. Omar Mateen, the man who carried out the Orlando shooting in the nightclub, reportedly beat his wife and called her the Afghan word for that one, I'm not going to say it. And both the shooters of the San Bernardino shooting, remember that in California, and the Las Vegas killings at Mandalay Bay during the big, huge concert had stalked or abused women. So there is a huge correlation between domestic violence abusers being mass shooters. So if we want to help stop mass shootings in the United States, we need to start looking at home in our own backyards in terms of what we're doing with domestic violence abusers. Okay, another national one. The mass shooting in Sandy Hook, everyone remembers that. All those school children being killed was committed by a man who threatened to kill his mother years before he gunned her down and 26 other people in the elementary school. Now this is something you're going to hear a lot through our series, and you've heard if you come to previous series. There is almost always a signal that something's going on, and people sometimes have ignored that. In vast majority of cases of shootings, the shooter has said something to someone that seemed a little off, or even said they're going to kind of plan this, and people haven't reported it. So I know law enforcement has been doing a big campaign about, if you see something, say something. If you see something, say something. Don't keep that to yourself. The other mass shooting we want to talk about is the one in Killeen, Texas in 1991, when a man drove his pickup truck through the front window at Luby's cafeteria, shouting, "All women of Killeen and Belton are vipers." There's a huge link between men being misogynistic and going on to be mass killers. So here's the 10 deadliest mass shootings in the United States. The Las Vegas Strip, the Pulse nightclub, Virginia Tech, everyone probably remembers that one. Sandy Hook, First Baptist Church, Ruby's Cafeteria, Walmart, very recently, McDonald's, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, University of Texas in Austin. So going all the way back to 1966. Many of these shooters behind these deadliest mass shootings committed violence against women, threatened violence against women, or disparaged women.
And so, why do we want employers to be concerned about domestic violence? Why is it your business? And the data is real clear. Again, every one of you knows someone who has been a victim of abuse. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 9 men experience severe intimate partner violence in their lifetime, and that includes behaviors, stalking, that causes injury, fearfulness, post-traumatic stress, use of victim resources, contraction of sexually transmitted diseases, and this is considered, again, domestic violence. Again, some data points for you. 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical abuse by an intimate partner. 1 in 7 women and 1 in 25 men have been injured by a partner. 1 in 10 women have been raped by an intimate partner. The data on men is not clear in that particular category. And 1 in 7 women and 1 in 18 men have been stalked. So part of the reason when we're talking about people and trying to understand victims' mindsets and why victims don't just leave relationships, because if leaving made them safer, they would just leave. Leaving does not guarantee safety for a victim of domestic abuse. In fact, they are often stalked and harassed after they leave the relationship. So stalking is very common in domestic abuse and quite common when we see domestic abuse homicides. 1 in 3 female murder victims and 1 in 20 male murder victims are killed by an intimate partner. Intimate partner homicides found 20% of victims were family members, friends of the abused partners, neighbors, persons who intervened, law enforcement, responders, or bystanders. So as we know from March 22nd in our community, this is a very deadly problem. It's something we all need to be concerned about. People who try to help are often then targeted. It is not uncommon for new partners of the victims to be killed by the former partners. So we have men who say, if I can't have you, no one can. They go and kill their ex-wife and kill her new boyfriend or husband, because that's what they believe they have a right to do. 72% of all murder suicides are perpetrated by intimate partners. So again, this is something we need to remember. When someone threatens, I'm going to kill myself, we interpret that as I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to kill myself. 94% of murder suicide victims are female. Things to think about for security and liability for your places of employment. There was some research that was done in talking to employers. 94% of corporate security directors surveyed ranked domestic violence as a high security problem. So again, what we too often see play out when someone is concerned about a domestic abuse offender that continues to come to a place of employment, the employer says to the victim, tell your partner to stop coming here. If your partner keeps coming here, you're going to lose your job. And guess what? That's exactly what the partner wants. So instead of providing ways that we surround victims with safety to say, what is happening that your partner continuously comes here? How can we keep you safe? I'm worried about you. As places of employment, you have a right to have people not on your property if you don't want them there. You have the power to ask them to leave. Victims don't have any control over what their partners do. Victims don't have any power to say, stop coming here. And perpetrators frequently use this to keep their victims under their control, to make their victims appear unemployable, and to harass them at work so that they get fired.
So let me just also add to that. A lot of guys in the program do this kind of thing where they harass her at work. And at the surface you think, well, why would he want her to lose her job? Because then they're going to have less money in the household. He wants to make her economically dependent on him, or he doesn't like where she works because there's other men there. And he's so highly sensitive that he is going to get dumped and she's going to take some other man instead of him. And so he's just really jealous. Jealousy is one of the very first flags that you'll see in an inappropriate relationship, where he doesn't like her working at a place because there's other men there, and you're going to talk to other men, and how dare you do that. It's all about trying to be loyal to him. And I know that seems odd because your worlds aren't like that, but that's what it's like in a lot of these relationships.
So I think we also want to think about, and this is always the hard thing, to really have things in place so your agency or company doesn't become liable when something tragic happens. And people start examining what are your policies around protecting your employees. What is the safety planning that you're putting in place for someone when they tell you that they're afraid their partner is going to come and hurt them? If we create environments and workplaces where we can provide that, where our employees feel safe saying, I think I need help, I'm not sure what's going to do, I'm afraid he's going to come here, you have the authority to put some safety parameters in place, and that's what we want people to think about. Between 2003 and 2008, 142 women were murdered in their workplace by former intimate partners. Again, this is why workplaces need to be concerned. If you're concerned about mass shootings, guess what we can likely say the mass shooting is going to be based in? Intimate partner violence. You have it at your place of employment right now. What are we doing to put safety measures in place? And more than 50% of stalking victims report being stalked at work. So, yes?
We've discussed this in Wausau Metro Strong, but victims can have restraining orders, but businesses cannot. How, as a business, can you put in place policies for that? Like,
In the state of Wisconsin, businesses, a corporation can't have a restraining order the same way, but you can say you're trespassing on my property, get off. So that, it's as easy as that. People are not allowed to be on your property. If you ask them to leave, they should leave. If they don't leave, you call law enforcement. So you can't get restraining orders to say, come away from here. If you have employees who have restraining orders, that person is not allowed on the property where they are employed. That is part of the restraining order that victims have. So hopefully you have an environment in which victims would let you know they have a restraining order, that they would share that information with you so that if you see that person on your property, you can contact law enforcement. A restraining order, and this is a little off topic, but just so people are clear, a restraining order is a civil matter. It goes through civil court when victims want to file a restraining order, but it has criminal consequences if it's violated. So according to the law, if a perpetrator violates a restraining order, law enforcement must arrest. So If your employees let you know they have a restraining order, we try to advise people to bring a copy to their employer, hoping the employer is understanding that the victim isn't the problem, the perpetrator is a problem, the victim is doing what they can to protect themselves. We have to say, if you're comfortable, share a copy of your restraining order with your employer, with the HR department, with whoever, so that they can help create safety protocols at your place of employment, so that if anyone sees this individual come to the property, that's a must arrest. They have violated that restraining order. So directly the company can't get a restraining order, but there's ways you can work with your employees, or if they're trespassing, they can't come to your property without your permission.
Are restraining orders and no contact orders enforced the same way? Can somebody be charged if it's a no contact? And
Yes,
they're
they can
coming
be
on-
arrested, yes. So
Okay.
restraining orders are a separate thing in that they're part of a civil process, but with legal criminal consequences. A no contact is put in place through a criminal justice process when someone is arrested and then there's a no contact put in place. If they violate that no contact, that is an arrest.
So sometimes the no contact is put on in terms of the bond, when someone has been arrested and there's a bond, or sometimes no contacts are put on by the probation officer, and that is just as good as gold as the judge putting it on. Yeah, Ben?
What we see from some businesses, organizations, is that they put together an internal document called a ban notice. So we might see this at the mall, the library, where somebody has come in, violated some policy that they have, and so they ban them indefinitely or for certain periods of time. And we sometimes help provide that to the person and escort them out. Otherwise, they can mail that, do what they want to do, but then provide us with a copy of that. That helps for the prosecution of cases.
Great, that's good to know. Thank you. Did everyone hear that? A ban notice? You contact law enforcement to help get those details on how to create a ban notice for your companies.
Thank you. That's Ben Graham from the Wausau Police Department. Thank you, Ben.
Okay, other reasons to be concerned. So not just because it's someone's life and you care about your employees and you don't want them hurt, there are some real dollars that are associated with domestic violence. So one study of bettors, 41% had job performance problems. They had 48% had difficulty concentrating on their job. That affects your bottom line as a company. Between 21 and 60% of victims of domestic violence lose their jobs resulting from the abuse. So I've talked a little bit about that. Here's another very difficult scenario that I'll share with you about what might happen in a situation. So several years ago, I was contacted by a local, a director of a local company who said, I really need you to meet with this person. I know she's in a horribly abusive relationship. She came to work, her face is all beat up. She's our receptionist. I can't have that face as the first face. So I went and met with this person, and clearly in my first meeting with her, she was in no way ready to, she was not in any place ready to move away from this relationship. She was very much in denial, she was very much protecting her partner, and she was very angry at me and at her boss for making her come talk to me. So that's a very difficult scenario. In that particular case, they had to let her go. And the boss called me and said, I hope you understand, I'm not a terrible person. You know, I'm like, here's the really hard thing when people aren't ready, when we're trying to protect people, but they're not ready to be protected. As an employer, when you do what you can, so for this person, I said, you did everything you could. There would be some people who wouldn't go to that measure. They wouldn't try to offer that support, but you did. I understand you also have a bottom line. And this is going to take away from your ability to have this person in your employ because of where they were in their recovery. And be okay with that. You did everything that you could, and now from here, we just hope that she can get to a place that's different for her at some point. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And that's one of the hardest parts of our job at the women's community is when we see people and we know that they're in danger and they can't see it or they're not ready to see it. But as an employer, when you see something, talk about it, address it. Sometimes they're not going to be ready, just so long as you feel like you've done everything you can to keep someone safe.
So talking about victims of domestic violence losing a total of 8 million days of paid work each year. Now, just give you a couple scenarios to help you understand that. Sometimes she's going to lose time from work because maybe she's been abused the night before and she's got bruises that show and she doesn't want to go to work with bruises. And so she needs to take 2 or 3 days off of work. Actually, the bruises show up about 3 days later, so that might be the time when she takes off of work. Or it might be that go back to that thing that you need to be loyal to me and you need to prove to me that you're not cheating on me and you're not looking at other guys at work. So you need to take the day off and stay home with me and do whatever it is he wants her to do with her that day. It could be that maybe she's getting a restraining order and hasn't told anyone at work, but she needs to take off of work to go to the legal proceeding to get that done. So there's lots of different reasons that victims end up losing time from work.
And again, the cost overall in the research between $5.8 billion and $12.6 billion that it costs our companies, our businesses, our country from domestic violence. It's also very much a healthcare concern. So as an employer, when you're concerned about the health of your employees, when someone is suffering domestic abuse, it has long ramifications and long-term effects. Again, some estimates between $5.8 billion and $4.1 billion for direct medical costs for people who are experiencing abuse. Some data has come out. There's some predictive tools that have been created as a result of some research that was done by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, who was an emergency room nurse and saw many, many homicides, victims of domestic violence, homicide victims. And she started doing some research and she realized that a vast majority of those victims had presented to the emergency department 12 to 18 months prior to being murdered. So she said, how can we do something about this? So she created a predictive tool that has been measured out and has been shown to, what's the statistical word?
Oh,
That it
validity.
works. Validity, thank you, yes. That it works, and this is something that can measure a potential homicide. And there's a tool called the LAP, Lethality Assessment Protocol. So that's something that can be used, and it's based on this research that 37% of women who presented to the emergency department were abused by their intimate partners. And so then all of the long-term effects that happen, not just the physical problems, but the long-term psychological impact, substance abuse, depression, all kinds of other medical problems that exist as a result of domestic violence are something we need to be concerned about.
So I'm just going to make a quick plug here that if you have a friend or coworker or a family member that you know has been abused and you know they've ever been strangled, a lot of times people think if there's no marks on the outside that there's no medical reason to be concerned. That's not the way it works. The swelling can occur inside the throat days later, and oftentimes victims then die as a result of that. So if you know someone who's been strangled, please ask them to get checked out medically.
It's also risk to pregnancy. The correlation between domestic abuse and pregnancy is very concerning. Many people, the first experience they have with battering doesn't happen until they are pregnant. So the relationship is not necessarily physically abusive. There's other signs going on and red flags, but the first severe physical violence occurs when they become pregnant. So that's very concerning. If you look at the data that we have, homicide is a leading cause of traumatic death for pregnant and postpartum women in the United States. This is a concerning fact. Each year, about 324,000 pregnant women are battered by their intimate partner. This is more common than gestational diabetes or preeclampsia. So if you think about how much emphasis we put on those particular issues around pregnancy, being battered by your partner is more common than those.
So what is the correlation then? Is there one? Why does that?
You know, there's not been any great research on that to be able to understand psychologically. My theory on that, having worked with batterers for 33 years, is that they're very egocentric and things have to be about them. And so now that there's a baby that's going to be on the scene, a lot of the attention is going to be taken off of him and onto the baby, and he doesn't like that. That's my best, unless you've got another.
And then, of course, there's other complications as a result of being injured while you're pregnant. Management issue. So when we talk about corporations and management, a survey was done. 91% of those surveyed said domestic violence affects both the private and working lives of their employees. More than half of those surveys are aware of employees who have experienced domestic abuse. And again, I would venture to say all of you know someone, even if you don't know that you know. 66% of executives said their company's financial performance would benefit from addressing the issues of domestic violence. So there are some things that were done, some research done, and people trying to get into companies to have them address the issues of domestic violence. And what they found that after participating in domestic violence training at some factories, the rate of employee workplace for counseling for abuse was 14 times higher than before the training. So basically just giving your employees information so that they know you're open to understanding that people there experience abuse, just providing them that information gives them the freedom to go get the help that they might need. A sample of 40 abused employees at the factory began using domestic abuse services, and their absence rate was higher than the factory's general rate. After counseling, after the services, their absentee went back to normal. So again, it's giving your employees a freedom to feel like they don't have to be ashamed of what's being done to them, that you are concerned about their health and safety, that you care about them, and you want them to get the help they need and not see it as something that is a strike against them in their employment. All employers can make a difference. So there are a variety of different tools that can be used. There's research that is out there on how you can make sure that your place of employment is safe for people to disclose, and how you can help people who are using abusive behaviors. Let them know that you want them to get help as well. We want them to change their behavior. We don't want to ostracize people and say that you're a bad human being. We want people who use power and control to give them incentive to change, to become a better person and stop the behavior. Again, focusing on the behavior, not the person.
And that's really why I got involved in doing domestic abusers treatment program. There was a man that I worked with by the name of Jeff Ryland back when I worked at Children's Service Society, who came to me and said, we want to do this program. The women's community contacted us and said, could you put together a program? Because we realized we need to look at this from a holistic perspective. It's not just about providing services for victims, but if we really want to stop domestic violence, let's go to the source of the violence, which is the actual abuser. And so I have been working with domestic violence victims as an individual therapist for a long time. And I really thought, okay, if we're going to make a dent in this and make any difference, we need to treat abusers, get them to stop abusing, then we won't have victims instead of just working with victims. And so that's why we do this tag team together. So we're going to stop here and see if people have questions. If people don't have questions, oh, good. We have some frequently asked questions that we get that sometimes people are afraid to ask, so we'll go to that if nobody else has questions. Yes?
So there are a couple of us media representatives back here. And this is, it's a difficult topic to report on, and it calls for a lot of, ethical judgments about whether or not we're going to report on it. But what can we do as reporters to make sure that, we are, not overexposing something, so that we're reporting on domestic violence in an ethical way that's not harmful to victims or the community?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, for print media, to not put a victim's name out there, to keep some anonymity around that. Sometimes even releasing the perpetrator's name and the crime is going to put those things together, but at least make it a little bit harder for people so that a victim's name just isn't out there. For visual media, I think if you are responding to a scene, to be very cautious about what you're taping and recording, because if you show the scene of the house, then everyone in the neighborhood knows what's happening, everyone that knows that house, everyone around there. So if you can do something that is clearly, I know people are concerned about community safety, so do what you can around that, but those are just some things that people feel very exposed when their life has just been turned upside down. So if you can, in ways, protect the anonymity of the people who are part of these processes. And then I also think to really think through how you could help maybe educate people who don't understand. So when you're talking about domestic abuse, again, because people it's hard to wrap your head around, So there are all kinds of reasons, and to point out reasons instead of, you know, they were in this relationship and they returned so many different times, to really educate on the recovery from being a victim of abuse is a really long and complex recovery. And it's normal and expected that victims leave and return to the same relationship multiple times. So I think in any way that you can provide education within the context of reporting on those stories, I think is always helpful, because it helps remove the stigma from victims and helps educate other people around trying to get us away from so much focus on what the victim's behavior is and really figure out how we can get help. And again, I think also with perpetrators, to really emphasize we want them to change their behavior. We want them to get the help they need to learn other ways of coping with their frustrations.
Coping with their inadequacies is really what's underneath it. It's not their frustration, but I appreciate that. Yes?
You talked about defense mechanisms and how we can convince ourselves that it's not our place. And I know a couple domestic abusers, and I struggle personally with ostracizing them and just saying, like, be accountable for your actions, like I can't be your friend anymore, versus being part of their rehabilitation process. And I know a couple of my friends do as well. So, like, how can the community help those people, especially if they're not willing to go through a safe program?
Right.
Like, I know it's not as simple as saying on their Facebook, hey, that's not cool, or hey, don't do that. You know, it's deeper than that, because like we're friends with the person they abused, right? And we have a loyalty to that person as well.
Yes.
And so you get stuck in this middle of like, how do I help be part of the solution? But I also understand that isolating them isn't going to help.
Yes. That's a huge tightrope. You really described that very eloquently, because I would say I wouldn't totally cut him out of your life, because then he doesn't have any healthy men around him to help him see how he needs to behave in a different way. And I know that's hard, because then you're like, oh my God, like it turns your stomach, right, to be with him and feel like you're maybe being disloyal to her. I would explain to her that I am staying because I want to try and help him realize that this is inappropriate and that he needs to get some professional help to change this behavior. The more men in your circle who can just gently say to him, listen, man, like that's not cool. I don't appreciate it when you treat your wife that way. How do you think that made her feel? Trying to help him develop empathy is a huge thing that we do in the counseling program. For him to put himself in her shoes and realize what that would be like to have that be said to you, or have that be done to you. I think the more you can rally around him and just keep pointing out, this is not appropriate, this is not appropriate, this is harmful, this is hurtful, and get him to, and having you as a role model as what appropriate behavior is in an intimate relationship is huge, because my aunt just, he probably didn't have great role models growing up.
Yeah, that's. Other questions? Yeah.
We talked about, like, as an employer, you know, being open with your employees and let them know that, like, you're there to help them. I know you have a list of additional resources. Is that, like, what's the best way of helping them, you know, other than stating that, you know, not to be afraid, to keep them safe, that you want to do those things, but what is a direction that you can point them into, you know, actually help them get out of that situation?
As an employer, help them. So this is going to be the hard thing, because they might not want to get out.
I mean, I understand that, but so, and that's where it's like not my place to tell that person,
Yep.
you need to get out.
Right.
You can't be doing this,
Right.
you need to get away from him. So without being able to do that, not wanting to do that, like where do I go? Where
Sure.
do I point
Yeah.
that person?
So let me just have people think for a minute. Think about how effective it is when someone tells you what to do. In any aspect of anything, right? We don't like that. So it's the same, even though we can see things very clearly from our world. Of course, we don't know what's going on behind closed doors.
Mhm.
So all the stuff that's happening in someone's head, we don't know what the threats are, we don't know. So victims are trying to navigate all of those measures. So as an employer, all you can do is ask, what is the best way I can help you? Let them tell you what they need. And they may say, I don't want you to do anything, I want you to stay out of my business. Then you say, I respect that. I just want you to know I'm concerned about you. I'm concerned about whatever it is that came to your attention that you're concerned about. And I want to be supportive of you. So let me know how I can do that. And then just go with that. So if you can find a way to let them tell you what they need, because if they have that freedom to breathe, that first encounter, they may be like, I want you out of my business. And they're angry about it because they're trying to figure it out. And they very, almost always think that no one knows. They believe that they've kept it a great secret. They're like, nobody knows this is happening, I've done it, and everybody knows. So if you give them that space, that place to breathe, like, wait, they know? And to not shame them for that. I was having a conversation with a colleague, and the colleague said, you know, she should know better. And I said, that, my friend, is why no one in your employee is ever going to tell you that they are experiencing abuse. Because what is she supposed to know better than to love someone? Because here's the other thing to think about. Think about humans. Anybody in here ever been in a relationship? Yeah. Anybody ever been in a relationship where your partner said something mean? Or you said something mean? Ever been in a relationship where you maybe raised your voice a little bit? That, whatever it is about frustrations, we have that, right? The difference is, so how many of you have been in a relationship, you said something really nasty to your partner, and then you're like, oh, I'm sorry. Right? I was frustrated, I shouldn't have said that, that was not kind. Anybody's partner ever said something nasty? And they say, I'm sorry? What do? We forgive them. That's what we do. We're human beings. We are very forgiving creatures. So when it's our partner that we love and care about and they say, I'm sorry, we forgive them. The difference is in healthy relationships, when I say I'm sorry, it is a fact. My intention is to never do that behavior again. To never harm my partner in that way. People who use power and control, their apologies are empty because they do it again and they intend to do it again. They haven't really been sorry for anything. It's just something that they do to keep the cycle and to keep the victim off balance so that the victim can remember when there were really good times. Because if the relationship was only bad all the time, it would be slightly easier to move away from it. Victims don't necessarily want their relationship to end. They want the abuse to stop. Two different things. So if we can give them the freedom to not feel like they're being told what to do, even if we really badly want to tell them, let them, give them that space to breathe. What is the best way I can help support you?
No helps.
The other thing I would add to that, and I'm borrowing this from a woman by the name of Sarah Buell, who was a formerly abused woman who went on to become a prosecutor in, I think it's Massachusetts, who said when she was being abused, she realized that there were 5 things that someone could have said to her that would have maybe made an impact and be able to have her understand, number 1, that that person cared about her, number 2, that there were some things that she needed to maybe take a closer look at. Let's see if I can remember the 5. The first one is, I'm worried and concerned about your safety. Number 2, I'm worried and concerned about your children's safety, if there's children in the situation. Number 3, there's nothing you did to cause this abuse. Number 4, there's nothing you can do to stop this abuse, because oftentimes victims think if I just act better, if I do things the way he wants me to, it'll stop, and it's like it's my fault. The 5th thing is, this is not going to change without any intervention. He is not going to stop abusing on his own. There has to be some intervention. When I have worked with victims, and I've said those things to them kindly, softly, nice tone of voice, over a period of time, they become to realize that, okay, you know, he's not changing. I need to do something to maybe get him into treatment. I need to realize that if you're concerned for my safety, I'm in more danger than what I'm realizing. There's been many women that I've worked with who've had their lives threatened. And they go, oh, he doesn't mean that. And I'm like, yes, he does. You can't just wash that away and think it doesn't mean anything. Large percentage of the time, when women are abused or killed, there have been threats to kill before that. So never, ever just brush off a threat.
Other questions? Okay, so, yeah.
We got time. We put these FAQs not knowing if we'd have time. Because these are the most common things that we get asked when we do presentations. And I have to be very honest about this. 37 years, about 33 years of doing domestic violence work. When I do a 2-hour presentation, a 3-hour presentation, I talk about abusers, and the very first question I get asked is that one, is why do these victims stay? I'm going to be honest, it takes me off. Because I'm like, why is that the question we're asking? Instead of asking, what is wrong with him that he's doing this abusive behavior? Why does he keep doing that? That's never the first question. It's always, why do victims stay? So, I get that, so we're going to address that. Interestingly, there was an exercise done once, I can't remember where this was, but they had a group of second graders brainstorm, what are all the reasons that you can think of on why a battered woman would not leave a relationship? Guess how many they came up with? 22. 22 reasons, second graders. They were all on the money. There were all many different things. So the number one reason is fear. Fear that if she leaves, she's going to be killed or she's going to be abused very badly. A lot of people think that if we just get her to leave the relationship, she's going to be safe, as Jane said earlier. The facts of the matter is that about 70% of the time when a woman is killed, it's after she has left her abuser. So that's a very, very dangerous time. Do you want to talk about economics, or do you want to talk about it?
Well,
There's a lot of different reasons victims stay.
so there are as many reasons as you can think of why they stay, so the common ones. But I want people to think about this. So if we picture a triangle, so someone in an abusive relationship has 3 options that they're trying to figure out. So they can stay and be passive. So they're in the relationship, they stay there and they're passive. That has consequences. They can stay in the relationship and fight back. That has consequences. Or they can leave. So when you are in an abusive relationship, those are your only options. You have 3. And there's consequences for all 3 of those options. So I'm thinking about, as victims are trying to figure out what is going to keep them and their children safe. So they're like, okay, if I stay and I'm passive, what are the consequences of that? What happens in a household where someone stays and is passive? Thoughts? What do you see that might happen? Continued abuse, escalated abuse, substance abuse, right? Because we have people who use substances to medicate the pain. We have people who use substances, they know just how much they have to bring so that they don't feel the physical assaults. Suicide, pets are harmed in the household, and kids learn that this is a normal behavior. So victims are trying to figure that out.
And I want to add to that, that this victim, because she's in this abusive relationship, that self-esteem is being beaten down, she's very likely going to become depressed. Tons of research shows children raised by depressive moms do not fare well because that depressive mom is not able to be present and able to take care of those kids. So kids are very much affected by this.
So victims that stay and fight back, all the same consequences. We have increased violence, we have potential homicide, we have potential suicide, we have substance abuse, we have kids that learn violence is the way you communicate. In those situations, we also may have a victim who is a historical victim and this incident is arrested. So what kids learn is that if you call the police when you've been hurt, you go to jail. So police no longer becomes an option for people in that household. So the other option is leaving. So Lee talked about fear. Number 1 dangerous time for victims is when they're attempting to leave or have threatened to leave. because the power and control has been broken. The message is you no longer control me. And that doesn't bode well with people who use power and control. So victims leaving is a very dangerous time, and we do a lot of safety planning around that. Other factors that keep people in place, we talked about economic factors, where abusive partners continuously try to get their partners fired so that they are economically dependent. It's a choice. So a victim has a choice now. They can leave and take their kids with them and be homeless, or they can stay and endure because they don't want their kids to be homeless.
Or they can leave and not be able to take their children with them because he hires the best lawyer in town and has more money than her and fights for custody and gets custody. You'd be amazed at the number of times we see that happen.
Our court systems also believe that 50-50 placement is in the best interest of all children. So you have a victim who leaves and now has to turn over her children to a house where she knows there's a violent person, and she's not there to protect those kids. So she says, no, yes.
What happens when they come to the women's community? Like specifically to that shelter, they come there, it's a safe place for them to be. By law, are they required to give their abuser, the person they're fleeing, the children?
It's very complex, so by law, yes. If they are married. So if you are a woman who has a child and you are not married to the father, you have sole legal rights to that child. The father has to go through the courts to get court documents to get any legal rights to the child. If they are married, in the eyes of the law, they share equal placement for the children, even though typically the parenting has been done only by the protective parent, not the abusive parent, but they use that to manipulate and make the victim stay in the relationship. So what do they do when they come to our shelter? It really depends on the situation and how badly the abusive parent is trying to manipulate everything. So they may bring their kids with them, and every other weekend the kids go stay at the other parent's house. It's not uncommon for the abusive partner to know that their partner is staying at our shelter. They often know that just because of the cell phones and everything now. Oftentimes they track them through their cell phones, and so they see that they're at our address. So we have particular safety measures around that. But all the manipulation is still going on behind the scenes, so we're doing our best to put up as much support to that individual as possible. So we talk with them about safety plans. In the state of Wisconsin, when you get a restraining order, it doesn't include your children. In other states, restraining orders for domestic abuse victims include the children. It doesn't here. So even if the victim has a restraining order against the violent parent, the children are not part of that process. So it's very complex, and there's a lot of maneuvering we have to do.
Another interesting fact about batters, there's a great author by the name of Lundy Bancroft who talks about batters as parents. And they've done a ton of research, and what they found is that batters go for 100% custody of their children at a way higher rate than in any normal divorce when there's not an abusive relationship. So think about that. Go back to power and control. I'm going to hurt her where I can hurt her the most, and that's going to be my kids. So if I'm going to divorce her, I'm going to try and get those kids away from her because that's going to make her want to come back to me.
So kids are a big factor in that, in the protective parent wanting to keep their kids safe, because not always, but often the abuse transfers to the children. It doesn't always. So we have a violent person, but they may not be directly impacting the kids. So in our system and in our laws in the state of Wisconsin, that's not a harm to the children. In other states, it is seen as a harm to a child if you expose your child to domestic violence. It's not in the state of Wisconsin. So we know it's a problem. Psychologically, the research is clear on what that does to kids. But protective parents are trying to figure that out. They're like, I will stay here because I need to make sure my kids are safe and that they're not being hurt. And turning them over every other weekend to a household where I know there's abuse, I'm not comfortable doing that. I can endure it. Oftentimes, a trigger point for victims leaving is when the abuse transfers and they start abusing the children. So victims are like, I'm an adult, I can take it, I can deal with it. They start hurting my kids, I'm out. Again, just like victims think that their employers and their friends don't know, they also think their kids don't know. The kids absolutely know.
They always do.
We do intake with adults and the children that come into our shelter, and when we talk to the kids about the situation and we bring that to the protective parent, and they are surprised. I didn't know that they had that. They were always sleeping, or they were, at the neighbors. They never knew anything. I made sure that I kept everything cool until they went to bed. Kids absolutely know what's going on, and they're absolutely affected. So parents are trying to figure that out. Victims are trying to figure that out. I don't want to be homeless with my children. I don't want to turn them over to a violent person every other weekend. I'm economically dependent. There are cultural reasons. Within some cultures, leaving a marriage does not happen. It is not an option. So how do we work with that victim to stay safe, knowing that they're not leaving? And leaving isn't necessarily the goal. We need to be clear about that. If our goal is to get victims to leave, we are setting them up for failure. If our goal is to keep victims safe, we can do that in different ways. That doesn't necessarily require them to leave, because some will not. When they married, they promised to God and all of their friends and all their family present, all of those vows that they take very seriously. They're not leaving this marriage. How do we keep them safe within that and not say to them, blame them for staying in this marriage? They're trying to make it work. They have very sacred vows. They have cultural context. All of these things play out for why victims stay.
And that brings us to a really big reason why victims stay. When Jane talked before about human beings being very forgiving, there's also a very common trait with human beings, but especially women, is hope. Women are raised in this culture and it's very subtle, but when you think about it, we are raised that we are more responsible for the success of a relationship than the man is. There's many subtle messages that are given to us. And so, when something's not going well in a relationship, as I said before, he's not being abusive 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So in between those times of abuse are happy times where he's loving, he's nurturing, he's caring, he's being nice, or at least there's the absence of violence, which feels like loving and caring. And he promises he won't do it again. We're going to talk about the cycle of violence next time, but that honeymoon phase is very powerful. Honey, I'm so sorry I did this to you. I can't believe I did this. I promise I won't do it to you again. And she wants to believe that promise. And so she hopes that things are going to change. So many women I've worked with said, I just want things to get back to the way it was when we first were dating, before we got married, when things were good. And so psychologically, we believe that that's going to happen. So by hanging on, hoping that things are going to change, we hang in there. I'm going to give you a really silly example of that that's really short time limited, but think about a time that you've watched a movie. And it's like, it's not a very good movie, it kind of stinks, but why don't you shut it off? Because you think it's going to get better, right? You think, okay, maybe it's going to turn, and then you get to that, and you're like, I can't get that 2 hours of my life back, right? Sometimes being in an abusive relationship is like that. You're just hoping and wishing it's going to get better, and you're thinking it's going to, and then it doesn't.
So, what about abusive women?
Well, I talked about that a little bit before. Do you want to add to that?
Nope, that's all you.
All right, so by and large, so let me talk about, I probably do about 1 intake a week for a woman who is arrested for domestic violence and referred to me for a safe program assessment. I would say probably 98% of the time when I do a history with her and I go over the power and control wheel, she's not using things on the power and control wheel. She is not an abuser. She's not using economic abuse. She's not using isolation. Has she called him some nasty names? Yes. Have any of us called our partners nasty names? Probably yes, right? I don't see her having control of the purse strings or of the family's finances. I don't see her threatening him, intimidating. He's not scared of her. She reacted back in a way that was retaliatory or self-defense. Now, once in a blue moon, I get a woman where I look at the power and control wheel there, and she is doing things on the power and control wheel, and he is afraid of her. And then that is abusive, and we have her go into therapy with one of our therapists in-house because I know all of my therapists are trained in domestic violence, and I'm not sure that that's always happening to other clinics in town. It's very, very few women that are abusive. A lot of times I find that they grew up in families where there was abuse going on, and they learned that behavior from their dad or from their mom. But it's a very small slice of the pie.
So maybe you want to address the is it learned or born with it question.
Okay, good, yeah. So here's what I always say, when I'm speaking to audiences, I'm very fully aware that some of you in this audience maybe grew up in families where there was abuse going on. You maybe are in an abusive relationship right now. You maybe are using some abusive things towards an intimate partner. I want to give you some hope about this. It is not something you're born with. A lot of guys who come into my program say, my dad was this way, my grandpa was this way, my uncles are this way, so it's got to be something genetically defective in our family. Nope, absolutely no research to support that. What it is a learned behavior. So it's what I said earlier, it starts with that backdrop of a culture that gives men the right to wear the pants in the family, that gives men the right to have the decision-making power, to have more clout, if you will, than women. And unfortunately, our culture is like that. It's better than it used to be, but it's still that way. Then when you have that boy visually seeing his father be abusive to his mother physically, or maybe there wasn't physical abuse, but he hears his father calling his mother horrible names. He hears his father putting women down and talking misogynistically about women. He takes that in as a little boy, and that's what he becomes. But he can unlearn that behavior, which is what I'm all about with the SAFE program. I wouldn't be doing that for 33 years if I didn't think there was a way that we could help those people change that behavior. And that's exactly what we're doing in the group therapy.
And I know there's another question on the next slide, but I think this would be a good time to address victims who choose more abusive partners. So why do they keep choosing them?
Okay, so you're going to jump in and talk about, okay, so from a psychological standpoint, right, from a mental health therapy standpoint, here's kind of a rule of thumb, if you will, about how we pick our partners. We pick our partners subconsciously. There are a lot of things that Sigmund Freud talked about that's kind of a bunch of crap, but there's one thing he was right on the money about, and that's something called a model, as in our subconscious mind has a map of everything that's ever happened in our lifetimes. The most important part of our lifetime is childhood. The other most important part about childhood is our relationship with our caregivers, so our moms and our dads. If we have more time, I'll do an exercise with you where you write down your mom's physical traits and your mom's good personality traits and your mom's bad personality traits. Then I'd have you do the same thing for your dad. If you weren't raised by your mom or dad, foster parents, step-parents, whoever there were important people in your life, or maybe a sibling. I'm an identical twin, and so in my model, my twin is in there. And then I would have you make a list of everybody who had intimate partner relationships that were significant relationships, and do the same thing for theirs. And then I'd have you circle all the ones that are similar. And I can guarantee you'd go, oh my God, I keep dating guys that are just like my dad. Or just like my mom. Does it always have to be the opposite gender? It's the parent that you had the most discourse with, that you had the most difficulty with. We're subconsciously trying to fix that. And so we pick partners a lot of times that have some of those negative traits that our mom or dad did. The other part to it is that our subconscious mind always goes for things. I'm hitting it, all right? You just got married. Our subconscious mind goes for things that seem familiar to us. So a lot of times you find kids who grew up in families where they were physically abused, and then they're married someone who's abusive to them. That doesn't shock me at all, because the subconscious mind goes, oh, I know that. I recognize that. Even though it's unhealthy, it feels comfortable, it feels like I know it, and so it gravitates towards it. Does that make sense? Okay. Do you want to talk about the other part?
Yeah, and the other piece of that is when you grow up in those households and people who use manipulation, you're more vulnerable. So the vulnerabilities of victims become a target for people who use power and control. Most people who have experienced other abuses or who have been in a previously abusive relationship are more vulnerable and are easier targets for predators who prey on them to be abusive or to assault. So that's a piece of it too, that they become more vulnerable. And so it's not necessarily that they picked as much as they were picked.
Right.
And in the mind of victims, we work with a number of victims who are in abusive relationships with various different partners, and in their mind they say, well, he's not banging my head against the wall. He's just pulling my hair. So they have a scale in their world of what abuse means because they endured all of this, and well, he's not that bad. It's still bad. But in their world, their comparison, and it's familiar, so they're like, no. And when we talk about what a healthy relationship is, and this is when we do with young people in schools, for those who are living in homes where it's abuse, the stuff we're talking about is not normal.
Right.
Because they've not seen this. What are you talking about? Respect? That's not what respect looks like. Respect looks like slamming my fist on the table until everyone sits up and is startled. Well, no, that's not respect. But when that's not a reality, when they've never seen that, the stuff that we talk about that's healthy, that affirms you, they're like, that's not normal. So we have to help reprogram thinking what normal and what healthy relationships are. Because what they see is, this is what life is. Love hurts. No, it doesn't actually. Love doesn't hurt. That's not love. If you're hurting, that's not love.
Okay, do we want to tackle the one about are there specific cultures that are more violent than others?
Yes. The answer is no.
Right.
Across the board, no. So violence happens in every culture throughout everywhere. We hear atrocities of all kinds of things. So specifically when we're talking about domestic abuse, the cultural overlays depend on where you are. So there may be things that happen within your cultural context. So overall, in our entire cultural context, we still have very gendered roles that keep us kind of in these roles of what we're supposed to do. Men do this, women do this, so that helps contribute to our overall issues with domestic abuse. We also have that women still are not equal citizens in our culture, so that adds to it as well. And then you have other cultures within our overall culture, particularly when we're working with our Hmong community and talking with our victims who are Hmong. They are experiencing a very patriarchal culture that we have to work with the entire community to help support those victims because their voice is even more muffled than other non-Hmong voices. So we have 3 Hmong advocates that help us make sure we are being culturally sensitive and understanding things in ways that as a non-Hmong person is hard for me to understand. They are not more violent than non-Hmong people. There are just some contexts that they have within their clan structure, within how they are taught that men are supposed to be, and good Hmong men do this, and good Hmong women do this. They are still very scripted in what a good Hmong woman does, and so that's part of it. They're not more violent. Statistically, it's just we see it highlighted more because we have a very large concentration of Hmong people here. And that's true across other cultures. Because of our Hmong advocates, I have more knowledge, information given to me about that than other cultures. But for us in this area, our Hmong community needs support and needs to be part of our overall community in all of these conversations. And they're not more violent than the non-Hmong community.
Do we have more questions? Oh, we do? Okay. Okay, can't a victim just call the police for safety? So, the police cannot solve all problems and all issues. And even if he's arrested, he's going to get bonded out, and then he'll be out, and he can have access to her after the 72-hour no contact. Wisconsin mandatory arrest is their 72 hours no contact after that. So it's kind of like when Jane talks about if we just get her to leave, she's going to be safe. A lot of people think if we just call the cops, she's going to be safe. I'm not saying don't call the cops, but just know that that's going to be a limited thing that's going to help as well.
And I think it's important to also understand that not everybody sees the police as someone who is their support.
Oh, yeah.
So when we have immigrant populations, we don't know where they came from, what was happening there, but for many of our immigrants, their law enforcement in the country where they came from are corrupted, and we're the ones who were causing the abuse and violence. We have immigrant people that we work with who came from countries where the police were the ones who were trafficking them. So for their context and their upbringing, law enforcement was not seen as someone who was there to protect them. Law enforcement was part of the perpetrator circle. So that's a part of the context we have to understand. For other people, again, if there was a victim who for many years had been being abused, they lash out and then they get arrested, they are no longer going to see the criminal justice system as supporting them. They're likely not going to call the police again. So that is also reasons why people might not call the police. It's a very interesting thing I'll share with you. My shift personally in this profession. So when I first started as an advocate 25 years ago, I was adamant that victims always get to choose. They always get to choose, and don't ever call the police unless the victims want you to call the police. And now I know 18 domestic violence homicide victims. So at this point in time, the only thing I know for sure is if no one calls, nothing changes. Could calling the police escalate and cause them to be more abusive? No. They don't need the police to be abusive. They have already shown us they're abusive without someone calling the police. They're already doing that. So our fear that if we call the police, it's going to get worse. No. They might use that as an excuse. You know, if you wouldn't have called the police, I wouldn't have to do this. But they would have found another excuse anyway. People are afraid to get involved because they don't want to make it worse. Could it make it worse? Possibly. Could you lose your friend because you called the police? Possibly. Could you lose that friend because they are actually still alive to be lost because you called the police? At this moment in time, I have changed my philosophy, and I now believe sometimes victims don't know what danger they're in. And I would not be able to sleep with myself if I was so afraid for someone and I didn't call the police and they're my next homicide victim. I know nothing changes if no one knows. Could they still die? Yes. But could they be saved? Also yes.
Next question, are people who experience or commit domestic violence low income and uneducated? The answer is no. Let me tell you about all my men that I've had in treatment over the last 33 years. I've had doctors, I've had lawyers, I've had school principals, I've had teachers, I've had insurance salesmen, all kinds of middle class businessmen, and of course I've had lower income, blue collar people as well. It is not anything about only the low income people that are doing this. Oftentimes I find that the white collar guys are just more sophisticated. They maybe aren't doing as much physical abuse, but they're doing all those other controlling behaviors to keep her under his thumb. And they are more astute at knowing how to do that and better at trying to knock down her self-esteem in doing that. Oftentimes I find that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that some of the higher income women don't go to the women's community because they don't need to seek shelter. They maybe have a second home, they have a cottage up north, and they can go there when they need to have a respite and get away for a little while. So sometimes it looks like it's skewed. It's just that people have different resources, and so you're going to see different people at our place or at the women's community based on those resources.
Right. That's true. Yeah, there will be professional women who are afraid to come to our agency because they work with our advocates in a professional setting. So they don't want the advocates to know. So they might have a private conversation with me and ask me to keep it very private, but they don't want anyone else at our agency to know that they are experiencing abuse in their relationship because we have a stigma, because we still say what's wrong with her, because we say she should know better. So we still have that. So there are people who are professionals in our community who are victims of abuse that won't seek services because they're afraid they have too much to lose. And they're just going to suffer without support instead of have people know that they're being hurt by someone they love.
Okay, last question. Aren't these women just codependent? The answer is no. They're not codependent. Codependent is someone who really has their life revolved around someone else. And codependency is from the alcohol and drug abuse world, you guys. That's where that term came from. It does not apply to a domestic violence victim. It's not that she wants to be abused. It's not that she likes being beaten up. I've heard that question before too. It's that, as Jane and I described earlier, she feels trapped and doesn't feel like there's a way to get out, or there's a way to stop the violence, because she doesn't have the power to stop the violence. Only the person who's doing abuse has the ability to stop that violence. May I add that?
Yeah, that's, no.
No, do you want to add to
No,
that?
oh, no.
Okay.
Good. So,
We're just about out of time.
yes. So thank you all for being here today. I hope that's some information. Don't forget there are 2 other series for this. And if you have other people in your world that you want to make sure get this information, they don't have to be at every series to understand what's happening. So if they come to 2 and 3, that is fine. They don't have to come to 1 to attend the other series. So I'll leave these flyers up here. Don't forget.
And please let people know that it's being taped on the public access channel. So if you know someone who missed today that would really like to see it, they'll be able to access that. That's what you would say. Okay. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.